We all recognize the iconic bob, the dark red lipstick, the short dresses. In America, they were the flappers. In France, la garçon. In Germany, neue Frauen. And in Korea, they were the modern girls. We associate them with fashion, jazz, glamour, and a touch of youthful frivolity. But there was so much more to them than that. They were a part of a global wave of women who broke with cultural norms and challenged gender stereotypes. And nowhere more so than in Korea. So how did Korea go from centuries of this to this? Well, it took some doing, and in the end, Korea wasn't quite ready for them. In traditional Korean society, women had little control over their lives. A woman lived under the authority of 3 men: her father before she was married, her husband after she got married, and her son when her husband passed away. Gender roles were rigidly reinforced. In well-to-do households, for example, the husband and wife had separate rooms where they pursued their own appropriate activities, reading and writing for men, and needlework for women. But on the brink of the 20th century, Korea underwent a series of profound political and social transformations. The Joseon dynasty, which had lasted for over 500 years, was coming to an end. Korea would soon be colonized by Imperial Japan. In the midst of this upheaval, the seeds of a revolution in gender relations were being planted, and it began with a movement for women's education. 2 groups called for education for women. First, there were activists for so-called patriotic enlightenment, people like politician Yoo Kil-jun, who argued that the role of women was critical to developing a strong and civilized country. The second were foreign missionary groups, and in fact, it was the American Protestant missionary Mary F. Scranton who founded Korea's first girls' school, Ihwa Hakdang, in 1886. Other schools soon followed, and it was in these schools that the very first generation of young Korean girls received a modern education. By the mid-1910s, women were beginning to graduate from the girls' schools. Many went abroad to Japan to continue their studies at the college level. When they returned to Korea, they held degrees in a broad range of subjects and undertook careers in fields previously considered to be male-only domains. They became doctors, teachers, and journalists. They became active participants in artistic and literary circles. Above all, the new women were active and open advocates of women's rights and gender equality. They believed in women's individual freedom, rejecting the oppressive nature of the old customs that subordinated women to men. They advocated for the right of women to pursue their own happiness. The new women challenged traditional norms, and not everyone was ready for it. But while this group of educated and enlightened women were a source of pride and inspiration for many Koreans, they were simultaneously targets of reactionary backlash. The battle for these new ideas and new Korean identities was being fought in equally new and dynamic cultural and urban landscapes. In 1919, following a massive protest by Korean people calling for independence from Japan, the colonial Japanese government relaxed some of their oppressive political policies. Koreans were now allowed to publish newspapers and magazines and have social gatherings. For a couple of brief but significant decades, Korean culture flourished despite Japanese colonial rule. The Seoul of this time was a diverse and divided metropolis. Koreans, Japanese colonists, Westerners, and a Chinese community each had their own districts, with their own distinctive culture and architectural styles. Of these, the most prosperous and bustling area was the Japanese district, Namcheon, where the streets were lined with bars, cafes, restaurants, book and toy stores, as well as luxury shops selling jewelry, watches, cosmetics, shoes, and other accessories. And by the 1930s, 5 large department stores had opened. All were equipped with modern conveniences, and many boasted roof gardens, roller skating rinks, and even miniature zoos. These stores were more than a place to shop. They were social hubs. People came for leisure, cultural cultivation, and entertainment. Importantly, these department stores allowed ordinary people to indulge in a temporary fantasy of material abundance and cultural affluence. And it was into this environment that the second generation of modern Korean women came of age. These new so-called modern girls came from all walks of life. They could be students, urban working women, department store clerks, bank tellers, or waitresses. And importantly, unlike the new women who were defined by their educational accomplishments and political and social advocacy, Being a modern girl didn't mean you had to have any political or social concerns or views. What united them instead was their embrace of the new material culture that surrounded them. The end of World War I had ushered in a period of unprecedented global economic interdependence. Advancements in communication, industrialization, economic cooperation, and the rise of the multinational corporation were bringing the people of the world together to sell them products. An influx of affordable, mass-produced commodities was arriving all over the world, and Korea's shores were no exception. In the 1920s, magazines, especially women's magazines, emerged in a form that we would recognize today. They promoted consumer culture under the guise of providing practical knowledge. And of course, they were also filled with an endless tableau of commercial advertisements. Film also strongly influenced the consumer culture of the 1920s and 30s. By the 1920s, Seoul had 12 movie theaters, and movies had become a regular feature of city life. By the mid-1920s, American movies accounted for 95% of the films shown. Korea, like so many places, was suddenly steeped in the culture portrayed on the silver screen. It shaped their fashion, consumption practices, and even their ideas of romance. So it was in magazines and film that the image of the modern girl was first introduced to the world. And it was only a matter of time before the same slim girl with bobbed hair, red lips, provocative clothing, and cloche hat could be found on 5 continents. In Korea, women with these new haircuts were called danbalmori, meaning short-haired, or pejoratively, modan girl. While their predecessors, the new women, had campaigned to reform restrictive traditional clothing for women, the modern girls simply adopted Western clothing fashions. And to show off their fashionable clothes and haircuts, the modern girls availed themselves of every other aspect of modern popular culture, and the culture of spectacle, such as owning gramophone records, frequenting cafes and movies, and going dancing. While the new women and modern girls were both curious, stimulating, and frequent subjects for magazines and newspaper articles and photos, their reception in Korean society was mostly very negative. The reaction came from many directions. For one, conservative neo-Confucian attitudes still pervaded Korea. Modern girls were seen to conflict with traditional female virtues like modesty, chastity, and submissiveness. And in a reaction to Japanese colonial rule, Korean nationalists among the elite were invested in promoting the use of native Korean products. The modern girls, whose culture was based in both ideological and material imports, became an easy target from the nationalist perspective as well. After the worldwide economic recession in 1929, Korea's economy struggled, and criticism of the modern girls strengthened further. Both nationalists and conservatives painted these women as self-centered, unchaste, frivolous consumers with no interest in Korea's difficult economic realities or its tragic status as a Japanese colony. They were stigmatized and devalued as members of society. Male writers, editors, and publishers who dominated the print industry, even the women's magazines, filled their pages with articles, columns, and cartoons lambasting modern girls. Their criticisms were not about the modern girls themselves, so much as the fear and pressure that Korean men felt to meet women's changing expectations, and perhaps even more fundamental insecurities about their place in a changing world. Korea remained an intensely patriarchal society, and men of all social strata felt uncomfortable about the rapid change of the women's role in society and in the home. Modern girls, the consumers of so many commodities, had themselves become commodified objects to entertain the rest of society. In 1937, Japan invaded Manchuria, beginning the Sino-Japanese War, and in 1941, attacked Pearl Harbor, entering World War II. As subjects of the Japanese Empire, Koreans were greatly impacted by these wars. Young Korean men were drafted into the military or sent off as laborers, and young women were mobilized as factory workers. Austerity and frugality were inevitable. Women were encouraged to wear simple and practical clothes, like the mop, basically a working tube. The glory days of high fashion and high life for the modern girls was over. Under the pressure of war, the traditional ideology of wise mother and good wife was a resurgent power in Korean society. Motherhood was emphasized in both painting and literature. Although the heyday of the new women and modern girls was ultimately short-lived, their aspirations and activities had a lasting impact. Both groups were pioneers who openly challenged different aspects of the Confucian tradition and the role of women in Korea. They were also the first generations to participate in a new global world and a global capitalism. The new women, products of a tumultuous transitional period, sought to reform society and liberate women from traditional restrictions. Meanwhile, the self-centered materialist lifestyle for which modern girls were criticized was a different kind of rebellion against gender norms and tradition. Material consumption allowed them to reach towards a new independence, to exercise a measure of control over their own bodies. It was an early expression of a more individualist culture that would eventually come to Korea. And although not explicitly political, they also took risks to fulfill a powerful desire for something better, to find some alternative to the restrictive culture they had grown up in. The outlet they found for that energy happened to be in the adoption of commercialized Western popular culture, but the yearning for change, the implicit condemnation of oppressive traditions, was deeply authentic. More than 80 years later, Koreans have begun to revisit these historically vital movements. Modern girls and new women are now studied in fields ranging from design to art history and women's studies. They are being revived in books and on screens big and small. They stroll around the Gyeongsang streets once again, and Koreans and viewers around the world are welcoming them back. But as we re-examine these women and their contributions, we can't help but ask ourselves, do we now live in the society these women wanted to achieve?